Okay, back centre, thanks.
Yeah, Stephen Withers. It's been a pretty brutal campaign, and there's some people who've certainly put up their hands and have really taken some bullets, and the task force has certainly taken a lot of bullets in this. I guess one of my concerns that I have at the moment is that in the individual HHSs, what they've seen now is that they've seen the way the government has bullied and has intimidated the doctors, and of course they are now likely to, I think, probably to replicate this in how they are going to deal with the doctors in the individual HHSs. And I'm just concerned about how, I think at an individual level, or perhaps at a collective level within the hospitals themselves, how we can deal with this, because I think it is a real concern. And I'm just not sure that that we've been able to, bring this together in a very harmonious way, as perhaps the Minister has said. So I was just hoping if someone had any thoughts on that. Thank you.
Look, we might. Who wants to answer that one?
I think what has been said by a number of speakers today about acting collegiately, acting as teams and protecting each other in the workplace is true. There are still certainly plenty of remedies if people treat you unfairly to address that behaviour, but more importantly, under the contract, the arbitration procedure allows you to raise workplace issues. So, and that, the reason why getting that in the contract was so important is because it acts as a fetter on managerial power. If they know that a dispute they're having with you can go beyond them and outside of their control into an independent jurisdiction which will consider the issues independently of whatever the service thinks, that acts as a significant disincentive for them to engage in unfair treatment of you. But it's really a matter of being involved with your organisations and acting collegiately.
Thank you. Over here, please.
My question is to Luke. Can you please elaborate a bit more on the legislative changes to the Hospital and Health Boards Act?
Sure. Previously, Section 51C3 of the Act provided that a HED could prevail over a contract. And we were quite vociferous in negotiations in arguing that it was very unfair because it did not give you certainty in it. And that was one of the key issues in the negotiations, was the lack of certainty. They agreed to amend that, and without going through the process of varying changes to it, it ultimately ended up meaning that they essentially cannot issue a HED which deals with a topic which is contained within the contract and which is inconsistent with what the contractual obligation is. So, for example, they can't decide that they're going to introduce a new detrimental rostering clause because that would be in conflict with the contract. So that would not be effective. What they have also provided is that the inconsistency rule does not apply if they want to increase your remuneration or provide you any other benefit. So it doesn't restrict their ability to give you good things, but it curtails their ability to do bad things to you. And the next amendment was Section 65B. We were very concerned that they still had regulation-making power both in the Hospital and Health Boards Act and in the Industrial Relations Act, by which they could, for example, under the provision of the Industrial Relations Act, just issue new contracts which overrode your existing contracts. And so you might have read some of the stuff we published about that. And it was in response to that that they passed that amendment which provides they can't issue regulations which are inconsistent with your contract. So they're good protections.
Okay. Jeremy Cohen, please. The wee English fella. Are you standing up, Jeremy? We're uncertain. It's always so difficult to tell.
Engaging in a battle of which the Scotsman, someone who's unarmed. How, in your comment, you mentioned that in the contract we're obliged to disclose any other business interests or any other jobs that we're doing, and suggested there may be some sneaky ways of getting around that, or that you're still working on it. Do you want to expand upon that?
Yeah, you can.
We might talk about that later.
Liz Jarvis, thanks.
So I have two questions. One is longish and one is very short. My issue, and going back to what Stephen Withers was saying, my concern is that next year, when there is a little bit less resistance, each of the contracts will change just ever so slightly, so everybody's contract will read slightly differently. So next year, when it comes to re-signing these contracts, or in whatever period of time, we're all going to be forced off to go and get independent legal advice independently, and we're not going to have the same collective strength that we have at the moment. What are the risks of that happening? And this is the slippery slide, if you like.
Yeah. Well, I think that's, I can take your concern. I think it's very important that going forward we stick together. You know, we remember the power of the pineapple meetings that we've had over the last 2 months. I think it's important that we stay members of the union, and, you know, if anything untoward happens, we can always have another pineapple meeting. You know, I mean, the CAC is not anywhere near a perfect process. Like, so we can't really depend on that going forward as the way to, you know, modify the contracts. So I think, you know, the campaign that we've run has obviously been successful in getting some significant gains. So we have to remember in the future going forward, if we have another threat, whether it's the contracts, you know, the issues with the implementation over the next 1 to 3 years, or we, for some whatever reason, have another legislative change, or we get thrown off these contracts onto different contracts. You know, we remember what's happened over the last few months and how we got here and what worked.
But I suppose there's a risk that we'll all be on slightly different wording as well, which, you know, that these things are insidious.
The government's stated intention is that they're perpetual contracts, that they are not going to be dished out to be reissued again in 12 months' time. Granted, there is an absence of trust here, but what I think is important to note is that you guys have given the government a significant bloody nose, and they would have to have rocks in their head to take you guys on in that way again. The contracts that they're putting out now, their stated intention is that they will continue and they will be reviewed through the CAC process, and it's very important that when voting time comes for CAC representatives, that you make sure you get the right people in there to make sure that your positions are pushed, but also use your consultative forums, use your collegiate strength within your services, talk to your boards. I mean, they're all just as important activities as well. I mean, the CAC is not the only process, and the CAC shouldn't be considered that way. But I think it's unlikely that next year you'll get a new contract which will radically change what we've negotiated at the moment. I think that's highly unlikely.
I think the other thing we've heard from the radical left-wing orthopaedic VMOs, the other radical group that's enhanced the power of the union somewhat by mistake over the last 6 or 7 months is the Liberal Party of Queensland. I think Asimov, correct me with the numbers here, but I think was moderately in debt beforehand and has several $100,000 in credit at the moment. So the Liberal Party has definitely strengthened the union movement, and with that power, and with the show of power, when we've gone from 500 to 800 to 1,500, I would agree with Luke that we've shown the strength of people and that we do stand together. So it is a concern, but I think we've demonstrated that we will stand together.
And my second question is, just to be clear, we are worse off under these contracts than we were at November 2013. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Very clearly worse off.
You do not have the range of protections you previously used to have under the Industrial Relations Act. We haven't been able to get those back. The scope of your terms and conditions of employment are not as broad as they used to be. But again, I just reiterate, we are nowhere near as in a bad state as we were in January, and that's important to recognise.
Thank you. In the middle here, thanks. So, it's Mark. Right, how you doing? It was the glare from your head. I couldn't see. Mark Ray.
Neither negotiations stop here. Stop right here. Because it seems in a way like it's a sort of a defeat, despite some of the great things that we've obviously attained, you've attained thus far. But it just still leaves me feeling very miserable. We still have mass resignation. I don't see why we have to stop right here in terms of negotiations. Could someone comment on that? Yeah. I have no trust, and so many of the things have been brought up tonight.
Well, all I can say from the negotiation team is that I think this is as far as we can get it, given the current government's ideology in respect of this. I'm the greatest respect to Chris in the room. I think this is one of those matters that only changes with a change of government, because it is fundamentally ideological. We've come a long way, but I think we've achieved significant gains in making these contracts as safe as they can be.
Because I reject the whole premise here that they've gone about this with the haste, the needless haste, on the premise that it was the Attorney General's report, which they've completely misrepresented. I just find that offensive to my intellect, and we've come here so far. We still have collegiate strength with the threat of mass resignation, and I just want to put that out there.
I'll respond to that one. We will have some resolutions later when I think we'll have an opportunity to see where the rest of the room is at, and there'll also be some potentially some further work to see what the general feeling of the SMO and VMO group is on some of those issues. But it's a fair point.
Take the question at the back of the hall, please.
My main question was actually not so much... this is loud to everyone else as it is to me.
Yeah, it's fine. You speak properly as well, that's good.
Yes, if you could translate. My main question was really just, I think that going on from that last statement, their stated intent was to translate a mangled mess of a contract into a more modern framework, and actually they're taking the opportunity to put in a whole pile of bullshit, which we've sort of tried to claw back to some respectability and not quite got there. We've still opened ourselves up for the next bunch of SMOs and VMOs to be significantly disadvantaged, and I think that we should be thinking about them. They're going to probably, I'm not sure if the intent here was a pay cut by stealth, but I think it's very unlikely that they're going to be offered anything like what we are, and I think that having two tiers of SMOs is really going to hamstring a service.
I think that's right. I think a number of us have concerns there. It sounds rather like separate coexistence, which was the name for apartheid in South Africa, and it really was that. Stephen Morrison, I think, had a question that alluded specifically... Sorry, Alana. Stephen Morrison had a question. Do you want to use this, Stephen?
Thanks very much, John. The question and comment that I wanted to make really relates to the questioner before last and the last questioner. And it has to do with the differential treatment of new appointees from the treatment of existing appointees. And those of you that have looked into this documentation very carefully will have probably already seen the documents I'm holding up here, but those not, I would encourage you to have a look on the government website. In the contracts section, there is a set of documents called Senior Medical Officer Contract and Supporting Information. And one of the 5 papers listed there is called Schedule 3 Total Remuneration Framework Conditions. In that document, there are a number of tables which set out the difference between existing SMOs and new SMOs. And it's very clear in Tier 3, that's the KPI one, that existing SMOs get 25%, new ones get up to 25%. And those two little words are very important. And in a separate table in the same document, Tier 4 is dealt the same treatment. So there is the potential for a new SMO to be given, let's say, 5 or even 0% in Tier 3 and 0% in Tier 4. I'll give you an example. I trained a very bright young respiratory registrar who went through his fellowship at the end of last year. One of the brightest registrars I've had. He's now overseas doing post-fellowship studies, but he's coming back. And when he comes back, I shall have a post for him, which will be advertised, and he'll apply, as will probably half a dozen others. And if he gets through the interview okay and gets offered the job, and my chief executive says you can have 5% in Tier 3, nothing in Tier 4, sorry mate. He's a bright guy, ducks of his school, university medal, papers on the board already. He'll say, no thank you, I'm off to the private sector or somewhere else. And the CE will then say, well, you're turning the offer down. Okay, we'll hand it to the next down, the next in line. And the net result of that will be that I will lose this bright colleague. His career in the public sector will probably end before it even starts. And the public sector will lose bright people like him in favour of people who are desperate for jobs. Just think who this differential is going to affect. It's going to affect the new graduates, the young doctors, the current cohort of juniors that we have working with us. They'll be desperate for their first job. Some of them people from overseas who would perhaps accept any job just to get a visa. They will say yes to this. What's that going to do to the quality of our service in the future? So I see this as a huge issue, at least as big an issue as all the ones which we've undoubtedly had very satisfying wins on. But I see this as an enormous issue. And the question is, do we demand, with the power that we currently have, that it be fixed before we vote on and eventually sign the contracts? Or do we go ahead with voting on and accepting the contracts in the hope that the CAC can maybe get it changed further down the track? And I'd be interested in, can we have a show of hands for what people think about that?
Look, why don't we, I think it's an incredibly important point, why don't we take some comments from the panel first of all, Steve,
all right.
All right?
Okay.
And then we take it from there. Thank you. I think one of the key things that we did in 2005 with the MOCA 3 was it's about retention and recruitment. And we've talked and we've banged on relentlessly about this is not about just the health service for today, tomorrow, but for the next generation. And if we lose the best junior doctors today, then it's like cutting down the orchard. Those people will not come back to the public sector. We'll lose the brightest people. There's less teaching in the private sector. There's less research in the private sector. And all this will be lost from the public sector. And it really is about trying to retain and recruit, not just for today, not just for tomorrow, but for the next generation. And I think it's an incredibly important point. How? Do you want to answer that one? Or, beg your pardon? Sorry, Suzanne.
I'll take it. The point I wanted to make is I think Stephen's points are well taken and received. We were equally concerned about its negotiations and fought for it very hard. Unfortunately, the position of the other side was resolute and there was no movement on it whatsoever. We do have a resolution of our own to put to you all later on. It was one of the... We did take some questions prior to the meeting from a number of people, and it was one of the most frequently asked questions. In fact, out of a number of questions, and I've got them here, there were 7 on conditions for new SMOs, and they were all largely the same, which is, do translating SMOs get a raw deal? I think the answer is yes, they do, in respect of their Tier 3 and Tier 4, unless they can strongly advocate for them. I think that if we encourage our trainees and juniors coming through and any of those colleagues who are thinking about coming to work in Queensland to ensure that they are a member of a union and to take a union representative with them when they have their negotiations about their contract if they're thinking of applying, although if they're applying for a job it's a bit hard to do that for a contract negotiation meeting if it's also a job interview. Remembering also that the new SMO might not be a trainee, it might be one of us returning from overseas and taking up a new position, having had a breakaway.
There's been quite a few comments and questions online about that issue as well, and I think we've that's been adequately canvassed in terms of the questions they're asking. The thing I just wanted to add was that agreeing to settle this contract dispute doesn't mean that we stop fighting for the health system that Queenslanders deserve. It doesn't mean we have to stop fighting in the future for better contracts or for a better system or for a restoration of collective bargaining rights. Minister Springborg said in negotiations that a number of the things that they weren't budging on were ideological, and if that we had problems with the ideology, then we'd need to seek to change the government to change the ideology. So, while I've got the microphone, I might just put a couple more questions from
the web.
From the web, and one of those was about fatigue, and I guess in terms of fatigue, there has been definitely a watering down of the wording of the fatigue protections that were in MOCA 3. That's definitely the case, but there are still fatigue wording in a number of the documents, including the Terms and Conditions document, and including various parts of the contract itself. And fatigue, therefore, is an issue that can be disputed. And so I think the way forward with these contracts, if the dispute is settled, is to use the dispute resolution procedures to make sure that we are vigilant about fatigue arrangements, to set precedents about what is reasonable fatigue provisions and things in those processes. And the other thing I'd say is that all of you are going, if this dispute settles into negotiations with your HHS, HHSs have to have, under this framework, a fatigue policy. So there is collective activities that you can all take in your craft groups, in your union groups, within your health and hospital service to say, if we're going to sign these contracts, we need a fatigue policy and it has to have the following things in it. So they're all the sorts of things that we need to continue to do throughout this process and throughout everything we do in our workplace as a group of doctors standing together with each other.
Yeah, and I think it's really important that we explain to the government, whether it's Labour or Liberal, that a doctor, there are different kinds of doctors, in the same way that the Liberal Premier in New South Wales has just found out there's different types of bottles of wine, apparently. I can't remember the name of them, but then neither did they. But, you know, a junior doctor is not the same as someone with 20 years' experience. They might look the same in an Excel spreadsheet, but these are different people, and we want the best doctors in Queensland. We don't just want a doctor, we want the best doctor. Nick Buckmaster.
I just wanted to make a comment on the concerns that people have raised about people coming through into contracts, people like Stephen has said, those who may be coming back from overseas or coming up to become into their first consultant job. The bottom line is, what we have shown is that as a group, we have enormous strength. As individuals, we always are very weak because we're always concerned about what we need to do day by day within our own units, with our own patients. We found before the Bundaberg fiasco that the whole health system was falling apart, and that was because people were just giving up and leaving, and the junior people were not coming back into the system at all. And the government at that stage took a very long time to realise that they'd made a big mistake. At that stage, I think it's fair to say in many ways our unions were very weak because people didn't recognise how important, how strong we are when we get together as a group. We spend too much of our time fighting with each other instead of fighting about the things that matter. When it comes to the issues of there being a vacancy in a department and recruiting, the whole department needs to be saying, we want to have our new recruit come in as an equal, not as a second-class citizen, because that is destructive. And if that is not accepted by the local management, then we work together. We get all of the doctors in that hospital to say this is not right. And we work together. And then if that doesn't work, we work together across all our different health services together. I don't know why I'm saying together, it's a bloody dog of a union, but...
There's that solidarity.
As a profession, as a group of caring people who care about the good work we do with patients, who care about, most of the time, looking after our colleagues, we have to work not as individuals but as a group. And look, I agree, there is a risk that there will be an attempt by various bad managers to pick things off. Those risks have occurred forever, let me tell you. And it's because the unions have been in existence, as John said, sometimes a bit dicily in terms of viability, those that we've been able to even keep individuals being picked off all the time unfairly. But you have to be with us all the time. It's no good to go away from tonight saying, hey, look, we didn't win everything, but we've got something that at least we can work with, and that's what I feel. We have to go away tonight saying we have to keep together, we have to keep being members of the organisations and being active in supporting our colleagues in those organisations. Otherwise, we're screwed, because this is going to be a fight for the next 20 years, the next 30 years. There ain't enough money in the system for us to be able to keep working the way we believe we should. We're going to be fighting with governments of all colours from here on.
Thanks, Nick. Very briefly, two more questions. Second last, and then Louise Cullen. Just over here, thanks, in the middle. If you can speak at Glaswegian speed, that would be appreciated.
Hello, Tanya Kelly from Nambour Hospital. Firstly, I'd like to say thank you very much to the task force and to Luke and to all others who've done what you've done for us. I do wonder where we'd be without you. I don't think it'd be in a very good place, and I get that we're not all the way there, but it's a significant thing, so thank you. I had a question. I just had one question about the dispute resolution process, given that it's such an important process in all of this and so many things sort of hang off it. The actual the binding arbitration that sits in the contract is obviously a fantastic thing to gain. The actual arbitration procedure, though, obviously sits outside of the contract and sits in the policy E12. And I do wonder whether or not there's a significant risk there that that procedure could change and perhaps even revert back to the DP review process that was a possible thing prior to your last set of negotiations.
Sure. That was a matter of extensive fighting during negotiations. Was we wanted that process in the contract. We were successful at getting the unfair dismissal process in the contract, but they wouldn't move on that. But what we did get is a term of the contract which provides that they must comply with the dispute resolution provided for in HED 7 of 14 as at 7 July 2014. Now, there is obviously a risk that before 7 July 2014 they'll change this. I think that's highly unlikely. But it creates a contractual right to that process. Okay? So they can maybe change the process later on for other employees. That would not appear to me to be a sensible thing to do, but they could do it, but they can't change it for you. And as I said, I think it's unlikely they would change in the future. So it's a contractual thing you can litigate on. But you would never need to, because it's what applies.
Good. And the very last question, Louise Cullen's doing this to me. I hope that means it's a small question. I'm not sure. Louise?
I might refer to something else for you, John, but I won't go there. Thank you very much to the task force. Sorry, John. You called for that. Thank you very much to the task force for all of your work. Specific question, and how I think it was you that raised the issue about things like clinical support time, that we need to put that in our schedules. Are you going to be giving us some guidance about how specific or otherwise we can be in asking for things such as our proportions of clinical support time to be included in things such as our duty statements?
Yeah, absolutely. You can put a proportion in and negotiate that. We talked to the DG about putting a proportion in, and obviously that will link in with your duties that you write in, such as teaching, research, quality assurance, all those sort of things, and I'm sure that will help you in negotiating to get the proportion that you require for those activities. Yeah, and is that a direction from the Minister? Oh, yeah, and the DG has made a direction that they're going to implement the current arrangements and assess on a case-by-case basis. So there's an undertaking there to sort of maintain what we have at the moment.
I think what we're hearing throughout this is that this is a dynamic process. Feel free to correct me, guys, but this has been going every evening. These guys have just been chipping away at a brick wall, and bit by bit we're getting there. What we do tonight isn't the end of this. We've got the strength together. We've got the strength of ourselves, the unions, this room, and once we utilise that and harness it, we just need to keep chipping away. I think that'd be true.
Yeah, we're playing a long game here. We've just played, I don't really like baseball, but I use the analogy, I think the first innings. And we need to focus on the fact that this is a much longer game. And these incremental, using the processes that are available to us now to continue to make changes to these contracts. So I think it's important that we don't lose sight of that. We've had a very significant victory in the first innings, but there's a hell of a lot longer of this game to play.
Thank you.